of 1830 and 1848 in France. And today we're going to talk about the revolutions of 1848 that occurred in every other country in Europe, being in particular Austria, Austria-Hungary, I should say, Germany, and Italy. So today we're going to first, before we start talking about this, we have to go back to the Congress of Vienna in a way to understand why the Revolution of 1848 happens. The revolutions, I should say, of 1848. So the Congress of Vienna, we know, its goal was to turn back the clock, bring back things the way they were prior to the French Revolution. And so the Congress of Vienna was criticized for that because they ignored all of these ideas of liberalism and nationalism that were really beginning to build in Europe at this time. And the leading statesmen at Vienna underestimated this new feeling of nationalism and liberalism that the French Revolution unleashed, people like Metternich. And not until the unification of Germany in 1870 to 1871 was the balance of power really upset. So the Germany, the Congress of Vienna did their job in the respect that from 1816 until 1870, the balance of power in Europe was maintained. And until World War I, we didn't have a major war. So it really did prevent a major scale war like we saw during the Napoleonic Wars, for 100 years. And that's a pretty big accomplishment when you think about it. So we have, and I mentioned this when we talked about the Congress of Vienna, this idea of a concert system, this idea of collective security that we're going to see, in today's world when we talk about the United Nations. So there were all of these meetings, the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle, of Tripou, I can't even say all the names of these places, Laibach, Verona, their goal being to, again, maintain the status quo. If you remember when we talked about the beginning of World War I, and we had talked about how there was this meeting where Russia gets horribly embarrassed by Austria because Russia agreed to back Austria's annexation of Bosnia. That would be part of these congresses that we see throughout the 19th century leading up to World War I. So the revolutions of 1848 are going to be liberal revolution. So it's going to be this battle between liberalism and conservatism. So conservatism arose in reaction to liberalism, became a popular alternative for those who were scared to crap by the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. Early conservatism was allied to the restored monarchical governments of Austria, Prussia, Russia, France, and England. The traditional ruling classes are going to be the ones who are going to support conservatism because it's going to keep them in power. And surprisingly, the peasants also supported this because peasants in general don't really like change. Supported by Romantic writers, which we'll talk about later before the AP exam, conservatives believed in order, society, the state, faith, and tradition. So conservatives viewed history as a continuity. Oh my God, I can't speak. You see what the word is. But the basis of society is organic, stability, and longevity. This is what makes a good society. Not progress, not change. The only legitimate sources of political authority were God and history. So in some ways, they actually want to go back to the idea of divine right of monarchy. They rejected this whole idea of the social contract that we see developed during the Enlightenment. And conservatives believed that self-interest do not lead to social harmony. They only lead to social conflict. So they denounced individualism, denounced natural rights. To conservatives, society should be based on hierarchy. That's why conservatives tend to be your traditional ruling classes, because they would be at the top of this hierarchy. So we're going to see, though, that there are revolutions leading up to the revolution of 1848. There's going to be revolutions in Spain, in Piedmont, Sardinia, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which is kind of the beginning rumbles of what's going to eventually be Italian unification. Greece, especially Greece, is going to break away from the Ottoman Empire. St. Petersburg, 1825, that's what we talked about in AP World, called the Decembrist Uprising, when you had those more reform-minded army officers in Russia that revolted, and Tsar Nicholas I very brutally put it down. And that's why there isn't going to be a revolution of 1848 in Russia. We're also going to see independence movements begin to break out in the Balkans. So, this is the Ottoman Empire being the sick man of Europe and beginning to break apart. This is going to be the roots of our pan-Slavism that's going to lead to World War I. So, like I said, the Greek Revolution of 1821 is one of these early revolutions. So basically what's going to happen is Greece is going to manage to gain their independence and break away from the Ottoman Empire. And this is going to be a really big deal. People from all over Europe are going to go fight because it's, Western civilization and the root of, classical, Greek civilization against, the Ottoman Empire, which is this Muslim empire. So we're going to see a lot of people from all over Europe kind of help fight in Greek independence. So Lord Byron, who was this romantic poet, becomes a martyr as he goes to fight to help save, Greece. And like I said before, I mentioned just recently this whole Decembrist uprising that happens in Russia. The Russian upper class was coming into contact with Western liberal ideas because of the Napoleonic Wars. November of 1825, Tsar Alexander I dies suddenly. He was assassinated. He has no direct heir. This leads to a dynastic crisis. And so basically Nicholas, who is his brother, is named by Alexander as his heir before his death. The Russian troops were to take an oath of allegiance to Nicholas, who was less popular than Constantine. Nicholas was seen as very much more reactionary. Alexander I wanted to be a liberal czar. He was raised by his grandmother, Catherine the Great. So December 26, 1825, a Moscow regiment marched into the Senate Square in St. Petersburg, refusing to take the oath to Nicholas. They wanted Constantine as their czar instead. Nicholas orders the cavalry and artillery to attack the insurgents. Over 60 were killed, 5 plotters were executed, and over 100 insurgents were sent to Siberia. The result of this first modern rebellion in Russian history, this is the first time where the rebels actually had specific political goals rather than just kind of revolting for the sake of revolting. In their martyrdom, though, the Decembrists come to symbolize the dreams and the ideals of Russian liberals, which are really not going to get very far in Russia. Nicholas was determined that his power would never again come to question. He was terrified of change. We talked about this in EP World. He sent almost like secret agents to kind of break up different underground movements or revolutionary movements. He censored the press. He set up secret police. He, controlled what was being taught in schools. He very much cracked down on any ideas of liberalism coming to fruition in Russia. We also see a rise of Polish nationalism. The poor Polish don't have a country. We all know at the end of by 1792, Poland is wiped off the map. So we do see a stirring of Polish nationalism during this time period, the bloodiest struggle of these 1830 revolutions. The Poles in and around Warsaw managed to gain a special status by the Congress of Vienna within the Russian Empire. They gained their own constitution and they gained local autonomy. After Alexander I dies, though, the Poles were not very happy being under the tyrannical rule of Nicholas I. The Polish intellectuals were deeply influenced by the ideas of Romanticism, and rumors reached Poland that Nicholas I was going to use Polish troops to put down rebellions in France and Belgium because of the whole Holy Alliance, this idea of trying to keep rebellions down and maintain the status quo. Several secret Polish societies rebelled. Sorry that my slide is kind of messed up. Let me see if I can fix this a bit. Had the Poles been united, this revolt might have been successful, but the revolutionaries were split up into moderates and radicals, and they didn't necessarily get along. The Poles hoped that France and England would come to their aid, but that's not happening. So it did take the Russian army a year to suppress this rebellion. And by drawing the Russian army to Warsaw for almost a year, the Poles may have kept Nicholas I from answering Holland's call for help in suppressing the Belgian revolt. So Europe in 1830 is going to have rebellions in Paris, which we talked about yesterday with the rebellion of 1830, which led to the overthrow of Charles X. In Belgium, like we just said, in Warsaw. So the results of these 1820 to 1830 rebellions. The Concert of Europe provided a recovery for this. So basically, the Concert of Europe managed to kind of get rid of these rebellions, snap them all back into place. The conservatives did not reverse all of the reforms put in place by the French Revolution. Liberalism would challenge the conservative plan for European peace and law and order. The revolutions of 1848 are also going to be revolutions that are more liberal. These revolutions were successful only in Western Europe. Belgium does gain independence. Their success was in their popular support. They were middle-class led and aided by the urban lower classes. The successful revolutions benefited the middle class. The workers, who kind of do all the heavy lifting of the rioting and the fighting, they don't really gain anything. Therefore, these revolutions left much unfinished and a seething, unsatisfied working class. So, let's skip ahead to 1848. And why were the conditions in Europe good for a revolution in 1848? Now, I'm going to give you a spoiler. All of these revolutions fail. You already know the French Revolution in 1848 failed because they wind up with Napoleon III, who essentially is a emperor. I mean, he's going to make himself into an authoritarian leader. So these revolutions are referred to as the turning point at which history failed to turn, because all of these revolutions failed. But so Hegel and this idea of the Hegelian dialect, this idea that history advances through conflict. This actual idea of the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis, this is actually the basis of Marx and Engels' argument in the Communist Manifesto that history is a series of class struggles. One phase of history creates the opposite. So from absolutism, you go to democracy. Now, some of the long-term tensions leading up to the Revolution of 1848, going back to this question, why were the conditions in Europe good for a revolution? So, industrialization. This is creating a great deal of changes. It's challenging rulers because now you're having a larger, middle class that's going to challenge that hierarchical, aristocracy that feels that they shouldn't be entitled to rule. You're seeing rapid urbanization, and the artisan class is being challenged because of that, because now you're seeing this growing working class and many artisans are being replaced by machines. Another issue is the population is doubling in the 18th century, and that's leading to food supply problems, as laid out by Malthus last week. We also are seeing all these ideological challenges: liberalism, nationalism, democracy, socialism, all these various isms we've been talking about this week. Romanticism, which is an intellectual and artistic movement, which we'll talk about. And we see that the government responds to these pressures with being more repressive, like the Carlsbad decrees in Prussia, which were made to root out any of these movements. And we see secret polices being created in many of these countries. So some of the short-term causes of these revolutions, that there were agricultural crises. So there were poor cereal harvests. And when I see cereal, I'm meaning like barley, wheat, oats, those things which are the basis of most, especially the poor's diet. So prices are rising 60% in 1 year. So as a result, we're seeing an economy that is depressed with wide-scale unemployment. And the systems of poor relief are pretty much overburdened. They couldn't handle this, and the conditions living in the city were very, very poor. We're also seeing things like the potato blight, which we'll talk about in Ireland, and the impact that that had on Ireland, where the prices are rising in Ireland 135% for food in just 1 year. And for lower class people, that's something that they just it's unattainable for them. We're also seeing financial crises that are leading to this economic depression that is growing. Investment bubbles are bursting, in particular in areas like railroads, iron, coal industries. And again, the unemployment is rising very quickly, especially among, again, the artisan class, because they're being replaced by machines. So the working and middle classes are now joined in misery, as are the urban and agricultural peasantry. And of course, Metternich, felt that at the Congress of Vienna that he was going to tamp down all these forces of the French Revolution, all these ideas that are of nationalism and radicalism and republicanism and nationalism, and kind of maintain the status quo. This is where the age of Metternich that dominated Europe from 1816 is going to end in 1848 because of the revolutions of 1848. These revolutions, though, were not coherent, organized revolutions. Many different reasons in various different countries for these revolutionary activities. In a lot of ways, there were reactions to the long-term and short-term courses I just went over with you. There was a great deal of competing ideologies in different countries. So there might be, like when we talk about Austria, you'll see that the Hungarians and the Austrians, they wanted different things. There are different revolutionary leaders, aims, and goals in different countries. Oh, we also see this in Italy, where you have those who want to bring a republic for Italy and those who want to bring unification for Italy. And then you have some countries basically managed to have no revolutions. In Russia, it was because of its extreme reactionaryism of Nicholas I and how he really tamps down on all of these things. And in England, it's because England begins to pass some legislation like the Reform Acts and repealing of the Corn Laws that are going to make it a little bit easier for the lower classes to survive. So as a result, they're going to be able to kind of like tamp down those revolutions. So the second question, why was Austria the most in danger of a revolution? So why is it going to be Austria that's going to have one of these revolutions? Now remember, Austria is a multinational empire. You have all these different people that are kind of pulled into the Austrian Empire, dominated by the Austrians in Vienna. So just to kind of show you, this is the various different ethnic groups that live in Austria, or in the Austrian Empire. So nationalism is going to be a big issue for the Revolution of 1848 in Austria, despite also that you have a government that completely rejects liberal institutions, these borders that cut national lines. So for instance, we have, if you look up by the border of Poland, you have Polish living in Austria, but then you have Polish living in other places. You have Germans living in Austria because they're German, and then they're in other places. You have Italians, you have all these different groups. You have, in Lombardy, which is northern Italy today, so you have some Italians in Italy, and then you have Italians in Austria. So a lot of these borders are cutting up national boundaries. You also have a society that is still in serfdom, and so that's why we're going to see a major rebellion break out here. So Ferdinand I, who was the Emperor of Austria, he lives from 1793 to 1875. He felt that the nature of the Austrian Empire should be very, very conservative. He was very conservative, did not believe in liberal institutions, did not think they should exist. He wanted to see the empire be culturally you have an empire, that is culturally and racially heterogeneous. You have, again, like I just mentioned, serfdom, which dooms a mass of the people to life basically without hope. He was very corrupt and inefficient, and he was in competition with Prussia. So Austria and Prussia are going to be at odds with each other, especially when we look forward to a unification of Germany. So, therefore, the empire was vulnerable to a lot of these revolutionary challenges. So you have here Austrian students forming a militia against the government. So a revolution is going to break out in 1848. And like I said, this is going to be an example of competing revolutions, because you're going to have the Magyars, who are the Hungarians, led by a man called Lajos Kossuth, who wants to gain independence for Hungary. And then you have the radical students that want to kind of form democracies within Austria. So you have the Austrian students, like I just showed here, forming a militia. And then you have people like Lajos Kossuth, who's kind of pushing more for an independence of Austria. Independence of Hungary, from Austria. So you have these two competing things. So Emperor Ferdinand, even though he's going to live until 1875, is only going to rule until 1848. He lives from 1793 to 1875. He only rules, though, from 1835 until 1848. So what we have here is this liberal revolution. The February Revolution in France triggers a revolution for liberal reforms in Austria. So on March 13th, rioting breaks out in Austria. The Austrian Empire collapses. Metternich flees. The Constituent Assembly meets. Serfdom is abolished. And then the revolution kind of began to wane. So it kind of began to lose steam. The new emperor becomes Franz Joseph I. He's going to govern from 1848 until 1916, which is going to bring us all the way up until World War I. And this is going to happen because when this revolution breaks out in March, the Emperor Ferdinand, basically is going to be forced to flee. He actually flees Vienna. And the government of Vienna takes control of the country. And they kind of lose control. So that's why Franz Joseph is going to come in to kind of end the revolution. Then you have the Hungarian Revolution that is kind of happening at the same time, led by the guy I mentioned before, Lajos Kossuth, who was a Hungarian revolutionary leader. He felt that the reforms that were kind of forced upon Ferdinand provided for Hungarian independence. And the Austrians were like, no, we're willing to give more rights to people, but we're not willing to provide independence for Hungary. So the Austrians invade Hungary. And the Hungarian armies were managed to actually push back against the Austrian army. Slavic minorities resisted, though, the Magyar invasion. The Magyars are also the Hungarians, and the Hungarian army withdrew. Because even though the Hungarians or the Magyars are pushing for independence, they don't necessarily want to extend independence to the other ethnic groups within Austria. So they didn't gain like wide-scale support. The Austrian and Russian armies managed to defeat the Hungarian army, and Hungary is not going to get autonomy within Austria until 1866, when we see the creation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Tsar Nicholas I raises an army of 400,000 men in response to a request from Franz Joseph to put down this revolt. So we see with this that this was an attempt to create more liberal ideas, but these liberal ideas did not come to fruition. The Habsburg government feared more than the urban uprisings, they feared serfdom uprisings. So what the Austrian government does, and I mentioned this earlier, they freed the serfs. They freed the serfs, and what that did is that kind of like undercut the power of the revolution, and rather than the urban class managing to get the serfs to kind of help them kind of join together into this larger revolution, they basically undercut the power of it, and as a result, they were able to stop the rebellion in its tracks, because they didn't have the support. So they emancipated the serfs, because then they would have little reason to support this broader revolution. And like I said before, with the Hungarians, they wanted to kind of gain their independence, but they wanted to annex the surrounding groups, national groups, and they wanted to do what the Austrians had been doing to the Magyars or the Hungarians for so long, making them speak German and learn German culture. And the Hungarians wanted their own cultural autonomy, but they were willing to do that not for the surrounding people, and they wanted to actually lead to what they referred to as Magyarization. They wanted the surrounding groups that lived around Hungary to speak Hungarian and, you know, be part of Magyar culture. And the smaller groups surrounding them, again, don't support the Hungarians then, because at least the Austrians are the groups that they already kind of know. So that takes us to this question, and I skipped a question, and I know that, so don't worry about it. I mentioned everything I was going to discuss in that, though. How did the Hungarian Revolt cause problems for the other parts of the empire? So Bohemia, which today we would refer to as the Czech Republic. So Bohemia was split between, you know, Pan-Slavs, people that wanted to create a Slavic state, and Pan-Germans. Remember, there's large numbers of Germans living in Bohemia or the Czech Republic. Think about the Sudetenland when we talk about World War II. So there was the Prague Conference, which developed the idea of Austro-Slavism, a constitution and autonomy within the Habsburg Empire. So the Bohemians were basically asking for the same thing that the Hungarians wanted, which was autonomy within the Austrian Empire. And the Austrian military ultimately attacks Prague. The Austrian troops were also going to occupy Budapest. They're going to occupy Prague. And basically, they crushed this rebellion and were able to maintain power again with the help of the Russians. And so we have this vision of either Russia becoming the new dominant power because the Russian troops are coming in and helping put down these rebellions, or they kind of continue to side with Austria and kind of maintain in some ways the status quo. But what this leads to, there's also a revolution in Romania, which also doesn't end very well for the Romanians. Metternich, though, is forced to flee after all of this. And we see that these rebellions are not successful in Austria. But what they do is set the stage for, in 1866, again, in 1866, Austria is going to become what's referred to as a dual monarchy. There's going to be the Austrian Empire, and there's going to be the Hungarian kingdom, basically, and they're going to rule themselves as, for the most part, domestically as two separate regions. But foreign policy-wise, they're going to work in concert with each other. That's when we talk about Austria in World War I, we talk about Austria-Hungary and not Austria. But that doesn't happen again until 1866. So for the most part, the revolutions of 1848 are considered a failure. I'm going to stop here for now, but I'm going to continue, and you're going to listen to the rest of this video talking about what happens in Italy and what happens in Germany. But I actually have to go do a Google Meet. So I'm going to pause here. So when you go on to Edpuzzle, there's going to be 2 videos for this day. All right. And I'll talk to you again later.